There we go. Okay. Thank you so much, Connie. I really appreciate that. Good morning, everybody. So the presentation today, as Connie mentioned, is creating favorable conditions for growth. We're going to be talking about early childhood social and emotional development. This is the first of a two-part series. And so today we're going to be setting the stage, talking about development, and looking a little bit about social and emotional development. And further in the spring, we're going to be doing a part two where we're really going to dig deeper into what's the Center of Excellence for Behavior Management put together, what we call a pyramid of support. And we'll be walking that through specifically for K4, K5, and looking at social and emotional development, and how can we support our little ones through universal best practices to more targeted, to more individualized. So this morning we're recording the session. I will not be taking questions live, but I invite you to write in the chat. And as I'll be presenting, if I can pick up some of the questions in the chat, I will answer them. But after we're done the recording, I will leave a part at the end of the session where we'll stop the recording, I'll stop sharing, and then people can just ask me their questions, and we'll be able to do that more easily than as I'm presenting right now. But feel free, if there's things that don't make sense or that's unclear to you, or you've got certain questions that I can answer as I'm presenting, just write into the chat. All right. And so, for those who may know Deborah McNamara, who wrote the book Rest, Play, Grow, she's one of my goodness, a person that I admire and that I've worked alongside with through the Neufeld Institute. And so Deborah not only has a wonderful book called Rest, Play, Grow, but she also has a blog on her website where she will talk about all sorts of different themes around preschoolers and, around aggression or around attachment and whatnot. So I just quickly wanted to read this quote out of an editorial that she wrote called "The Three Things I've Discovered Writing Rest, Play, Grow." We have become so consumed with how young children act and whether they are civilized, that we have forgotten that they need patience, time, and caretaking in order to grow. The immature ways of young children are not personal, they are developmental. Young children lack impulse control because their brain is not fully developed. They are egocentric because, in order to share yourself with another person, you first have to create a self to be able to share it. They don't use their words when emotionally charged because they are still trying to learn names of their feelings and lack self-control. They don't always listen because they can only attend to one thing at a time, and it isn't always us that they're attending to. They need to be attached to us in order to want to follow us, but they also have instincts to resist us at the same time. This was not a mistake, but part of a sophisticated developmental plan aimed at unfolding a mature human being. While we may be often confused by their behavior, they are only being true to their instincts and emotions. When I step back to consider young children and all their baffling and immature ways, along with how we treat them, I see clearly that we have lost our way somehow. And so I just really wanted to set the stage with this quote. It really spoke to me when I read this editorial about, shining the lens of the developmental approach and understanding that some of the behaviors that we see with our little ones, although we may not fully understand them or agree with them, it doesn't mean that it's a mistake or that they're doing it on purpose. There is a reason behind all of this, and this is what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to look at from a developmental perspective, from a physiological, from a neurological perspective, from the brain, why is it that they do what they do at their young age? And how come they're not little adults? And so, overall, so who are our K4, K5 children? And you'll notice I use the word children, not the word student. I think it's important that we focus on the child as a whole. We have this view in education that the student's job is to learn. And I want to shift this today where we're not focusing on the student who needs to learn, but the child that needs to have the right conditions to grow. And so we are going to look at the child as a whole, not focus just on the student learning. And so out the children that we have in our classrooms, that on the one hand are so delightful and so curious and joyful, also on the other hand can be quite impulsive and inconsiderate and really needy. And so we have the two flips of the coin, right? Where on the one hand they're just so cute and we want to squeeze them, and on the other hand, my goodness, do they push all our buttons? And it's part of the development. So let's dig into that. The way that they're designed developmentally, and here are three examples of that. I could be talking about so many examples, but I'm going to focus on these three right now. Number one, it is to be expected. We need to not be surprised that they have big emotions. They are pushed left, right, and center by their big emotions. Part of the reason why is because in their little brains that are not yet fully developed, they're only able to hold on to one thought and one feeling at a time. So when they're happy, they're fully happy. When they're upset, they're fully upset. There is no in between. There's no gray at that age, especially our 4-year-olds. I'm going to take time today to also make a distinction between our 4 and our 5-year-olds, because actually the beginning of the prefrontal cortex starts at 5. So there's truly is a difference between our 4 and our 5-year-olds. Where our 4-year-olds are much more immature in terms of emotions. They get pushed left, right, and center, and they flip from one emotion to the next. Well, we'll see them happy and then mad and then back to sad and then to happy again. And it's very confusing to us adults to watch them kind of flip from one to the next. There's a reason for that, and we'll talk about it. In terms of fairness, they have a singular view of fairness. Fairness doesn't mean we both get equally to them. Fairness means I get it all. It's a very egocentric view at that age. They're very focused on themselves. They're the middle, the center of their worlds. And so it's very difficult for them to share. This concept of sharing is something that will come over time. And it doesn't mean that we couldn't plant the seed or that we can't model it or talk about it, but for us to expect for the child, especially when they're upset, to be considerate and to share at all times is not realistic, because, and we'll talk about that later, they need to focus on growing their sense of self first before they can be able to focus on somebody else. Because if they focus on other people first, then the issue will become that they will not have enough space to be able to develop their sense of self. So it's normal at that age that they are egocentric and that they are very focused on their own, and that fairness means I get it all or I get most. And so, keep that in mind. The other piece too that is huge, and for those that are familiar with the Neufeld material, Deborah McManera, who wrote Rest, Play, Grow, is also a Neufeld Institute faculty member, and so the material that she writes in the book is from that lens. Gordon Neufeld, who's the founder of the Neufeld Institute, last year did a presentation on the wisdom of dependence. And so we're not talking about independence, we're talking about dependence first. And so how can we make space, invite for the child to count on us, to lean on us, to ask for help? And so some of them spontaneously will want to do for themselves. We see it with, even the 2, 3-year-old, no, I do it myself. They have this emergence in them spontaneously, but they only have that emergence if they're being satisfied and fulfilled in their need to attach and to be dependent on us. And so we have this view backwards in our society where we're looking to push independence. I promise you that if we fulfill dependence, that independence will come on its own naturally. The more that we hyper focus on getting kids to dress themselves, especially, in the winter with their coats and everything, and that we get them insecure in their needs to depend on us, they will get more and more obsessed with us doing it for them. And so we need to make room for their need to depend on us. And so on the one hand, we'll see some kids that are spontaneously wanting to do it, and that's great. We can celebrate that. But there's other kids for whom this rhythm is a bit slower, and they need for us to help them out, at least for them to feel like we've got their back until they can find their bearings and that they're able to spontaneously find their emergence. And so we have sometimes with kids this push-pull, or they flip back and forth between wanting to do it themselves versus wanting us to do it for them. And so it's confusing to us too at times to see the both flips of that coin, but it's to be expected because they're not fully independent yet. They're still kind of trying out these shoes of independence at time, but they're not fully independent just yet. We can kind of compare, for those who have heard my colleague Eva D'Agostini speak 4 years ago, you'll notice some of the slides will be similar. I'll be bringing back some of her concepts. And so this is one of hers, this idea of comparing our little ones to a plant. Having this intuition of being a gardener, and understanding when we're well experienced gardener, and if any of you have ever planted tomatoes, you know that at the beginning of the season, we don't get the tomatoes just yet. We first plant the seed, and then the plant grows, and then we have these really, spiky yellow flowers that look nothing like the big bright red tomato. And so we're patient. We give the plant what it needs in order to grow. We don't pull on the plant to say, turn into a red tomato. We have intuition and faith that over time, with the right conditions, the growth will come. And so it's the same thing with our little ones, having faith that right now they are these spiky yellow flowers and they look nothing like us being the red tomatoes, but we need to be patient and give them what they need in order to get to that place. The more that we tug and pull on their development, not only are we not getting the result that we want, and we really get frustrated because we're not going anywhere with this, but also we're hindering their development because they're feeling inadequate. They're feeling like they're not enough. They're feeling like we're constantly disappointed with them. And so, how can we, make room not for where we want them to be, but where they're at right now? And it will look so different from one child to the next. It's true that we have some children that are more mature in their fruit, that are showing, some emergence, some independence, some, also all sorts of these more, self-control and so forth, and other ones not as much. And although they're the same age physiologically, we know now with neuroscience and studying the brain and how the brain develops, it's not a question of age. It's a question of conditions and environment. You could even have twins that are born in the same family, identical twins even, and you could have those two children that are not at the same place. Even if they're in similar conditions, we each have a unique relationship with every single person in our lives. And so, or they will take in the environment in a different way. And so, even with twins, we cannot guarantee that their development will unfold identically. And so, how can we fulfill for that specific child, for their profile, their needs, their struggles with the environment that they've grown up in? So many of the children that come to us in schools have these horrendous, of their short little lives so far, these horrendous stories of neglect or of insufficient, being taken care of lack of attachment, of abuse, perhaps even. And so those children come at school in a disadvantage and need for us to be able to compensate and to help them as to where they're at. And so, as I was mentioning in terms of the brain development, we're not born with all of the faculties just yet. Although the matter is there, it's not that the brain continues to grow in terms of the matter. The matter in the brain is there from birth, but there's portions of the brain that are not yet activated at birth. And as we grow older, it goes from the stem all the way to the front of the brain that slowly the sections will get activated. And there's a reason for that, that we don't all light up everything at once. The brain is trying slowly but surely, as we're getting through the different parts, to assure itself that everything is functioning properly. And so it's giving full attention to each part one at a time. And so our little ones that we work with on a day-to-day basis are not using just yet really their prefrontal cortex, especially those that are working with K4. K4, they're not yet activated their prefrontal cortex. At K5, they only begin. It's between the ages from 5 to 7 that we begin to develop the prefrontal cortex. We know now with the research that the prefrontal cortex continues to grow well into the 20s and the 30s. And so think about it. The kids that we work with in our schools, not even just K4, K5, but in elementary and in high school, have not yet fully developed their prefrontal cortex to be fully available within their executive functioning skills. And so we cannot expect them to be little adults. They are just not. They're completely, in that way, different beings than us. And so we're able to temper when we're activated in our limbic system, when we get emotional, when we get triggered. If we are not too upset or not too tired, we're able to filter that and to slow down our impulses and to have a more civilized reaction. But even us as adults, let's be honest, we have our good and our bad days. And so sometimes we surprise ourselves with our impulses. Sometimes we raise our voice and that's not what we meant to do. And so with our little ones, they don't have yet that ability to be able to have perspective, that even if they're upset, not just to focus on the upset, but to be able to look at the flip side of the situation and say, I'm upset with you right now. However, you're my friend and I don't want to hurt your feelings. Or I'm upset with you right now, but I'm not going to hit you because I don't want to get in trouble. This requires perspective. And perspective comes from the development of the prefrontal cortex. Um, and so it's really difficult for them to have that perspective. Immaturity, not only is it normal, but it is completely natural and to be expected. The more that we surprise ourselves with the reaction and get destabilized by it, the harder it is for us to be able to structure and accompany them with a good understanding and a good vision of things. And so how can we shift our lens to be able to not be surprised and to anticipate the impulse? It's part of the design in the moment. And by the way, maturation is not inevitable. So even if we grow older, we do not necessarily grow up. We can have full-on adults that are still quite immature and sorry, I'm getting distracted because there's somebody that's trying to come in. Um, why is it doing this right now? Okay. All right. And so even if we're growing older, it's not by default that we've gained age that necessarily we're maturing. It's all a question of having the right conditions in place. So what we're going to be talking about today, and we're going to be talking about even next time in part 2, is what can we adults do on a day-to-day basis to put in place what we call the right conditions, the ideal conditions to help them be in a good place to have focus on growth. Growth comes from a sense of safety and rest. They cannot grow if they're not feeling safe. We know now, especially with the trauma research, that our little ones, and not just little ones, at any age, there's only enough energy in our body to either go to growth or to go to survival. And so those that are caught up with survival, unfortunately, the energy put into that survival goes to the detriment of going towards growth. And so growth is not happening at the same degree or at the same rhythm as other children that do have that same sense of safety. And it's the same thing with rest. I'm not talking about just physical rest. I'm talking also about emotional rest and even rest from attachment. How many of our little ones are constantly working at making their attachments in their lives work for them because they don't feel connected, because they feel like the adults are not taking care of them. And so they're not at rest. And so when they're caught up at ensuring that safety and security and attachment is there, then unfortunately it works against the energy in space for growth to happen. Now, the other piece I didn't mention before is that not all children are born equal in terms of the way in which they interpret and live in their world. When we think about our hypersensitive children, think about those children that you work with that either are ASD or that are anywhere on that spectrum of hypersensitivity. Those children, because they get caught up with the overwhelm of their emotions, of the overstimulation of the sensory world, have a harder time in their growth because they get caught up in their sensory and their emotions. And so for those kids, the gap that would have been for a neurotypical child 5 to 7 is now pushed to 7 to 9. And so please expect that your little ones that are neurodiverse will be most probably more immature than the neurotypical children that you have in your classroom. And of course, those that are working with 4 or 5 year olds, especially the 4 year olds, you may not see a big difference just yet at that age. But as they grow older, getting to grade 1, grade 2, now we start seeing that gap in terms of that emotional immaturity. I wanted to take a second to compare our 4 and 5 year olds because I know that some of you work with 5 and other of you work with 4. I really want to make that distinction to some levels. There could have been so much more to say on this. I'm going to give kind of like the overarching lines around the differences between our 4 and 5 year olds. First
And
of
if I
all,
may, sorry,
yeah,
what's
go ahead.
challenging as well is we have a lot of 4 or 5 year old classes. So we have the whole
Mm,
cycle. So there are many teachers teaching the K4 5
together.
in one together.
Oh, thank you
So
for
this
telling
is
me that.
so
Absolutely. It's
valuable.
good to know. Thanks, Connie. So in terms of the prefrontal cortex, as I said before, for the 4 year old, it has not yet started to develop. Whereas the 5 year old, it has barely begun, but it has somewhat begun for some of the children. And so that makes a difference. It makes all the difference, from the 4 versus the 5 year old. One thing that might be similar, though, with their 4 and 5 year olds is they still have these big, raw emotions, regardless of being 4 or 5. However, at the 5 year old, they may be able to start a little bit if they're not too upset, if they're having a good day, if they're not tired or hungry or sick. They might be able to a little bit have moments where they can have a bit of perspective and somewhat of a regulation to some degree of their emotions. But it's really just barely the beginning. You will not see this at the 4 year old. We see a lot of tears, that it's quite common for 4 or 5 year olds to cry, more so with 4 year olds, 5 year olds as well, of course. But there's a piece where everything affects them. They get pushed around by their emotions. Tears will come up a lot at that age. The difference, though, in terms of emotions around the 4 and 5 year old is at the 5 year old, if they're mature enough, from the little that they're mature, they may be able to start having the words to verbalize their emotions. They may be able to say they're sad or they're mad or whatnot. It's very difficult for the 4 year old to find those words. They're still at a place where they're developing their language, and so the language of emotion oftentimes is like an add-on to that. And so even if they have those emotions, they have a hard time naming them. In terms of imagination, there's a big increase at 4 or 5 year old of their imaginary world. And what comes with imagining things is also anticipating the bad things that may happen to themselves or to others. They have all these fears that come up where they may be afraid of the dark, afraid of monsters, afraid of being lost, afraid of being kidnapped, and so forth. It's so typical at that age because of the increase in imagination. But again, if they're not able to verbalize their emotions at 4, they're having a really hard time verbalizing their fears. And so they may react in fear, but they have a hard time saying what it is exactly about it that is triggering them. Whereas perhaps at the 5 year old, they may be a little bit, if they're not too tired, too hungry, too upset, to start voicing those fears and concerns. I talked about impulses, and so both at 4 and 5, they have impulses that push them all over the place. There is no filter at 4 in terms of impulses. They have a thought, a feeling, they act. It's in out automatically. Whereas the 5 year old may begin a little bit, depending on the day and how they're being triggered, to temper and slow down some of the impulses. But again, it will depend on the child. In terms of separation, what I mean by separation could be, leaving the home, leaving mom and dad to come to school. That's a separation. It could be leaving the teacher to go to another adult in the classroom. It could be, so many different examples of not just physical separation, but separation could also mean that the child feel like they disappointed the adult, and now in that moment don't feel comfortable or don't feel well in this dynamic where they think they've upset or disappointed the adult. This is what we call a psychological separation. And so for our 4-year-olds, they have little or no tolerance for that. If we get upset with them, it rocks their world. They don't like it when we get mad at them. They don't yet have enough development in their attachment to hold on to us when apart. And so it's normal for the 4-year-old when mom and dad drops them off in the morning for them to react because mom and dad are leaving. It is to be expected, even if they went to daycare and they did beautifully at daycare. Let's say that they were there when they were, very, very young. The daycare was actually kind of like their second home. And so every single time they change buildings or they change adult or they change environment, we are starting over. And so even when you have a 4-year-old that did well with their teacher in K4, but now in K5 is reacting and we don't understand why, they were doing fine last year. We're in the same building. Why are they reacting? Because it's a new situation for them. It's a new adult. It's difficult for them. It's one adult at a time, one situation at a time. They don't do well with transitions. And so going from the classroom to outside to a different adult during lunch, all of that is very difficult for them to manage because their attachment is not deep enough. I'll just take a second to kind of walk through for those that may not have read in Deborah McNamara in her book Rest, Play, Grow has a whole chapter dedicated to the levels of attachment. There are 6 different ways in which we attach. We go from physical proximity to having things in common to having a sense of belonging to feeling like we matter to now what Gordon calls love, which is basically emotional intimacy. Emotional intimacy, and the last one, which is being known, is psychological intimacy. Oftentimes, even if the children at home have developed most of these abilities to attach, every single time they meet a new adult, we are starting from the beginning in the way in which they attach. So when they meet you at the beginning of the school year, even if they have a good attachment with mom and dad, they start with physical proximity, which means that when they come to school and that they're with you and now they need to change rooms or another adult steps in, they are feeling lost and separated because they're attaching to you through physical proximity. And so the more that we can deepen the attachment where they can hold on to you, even if you're not there physically, and that's why as the year unfolds, we notice that they're better able to tolerate separation. It's not because we've practiced it. It's because they have deepened their attachment and now they have more than one way to hold on to you. And so we don't need to force them to practice separation. We need to get them to deepen their attachment to be able to hold on. So you'll notice in some of the slides, oh, and I forgot to mention this, sorry. All of the slides that I'm presenting right now, you guys will be getting the handout. You do not need to be taking notes profusively. I've got like so many different, information that will be given to you as is. And I did it on purpose to have sentences in the slides so you guys can go back and read them after we've watched this, we've done this together, and it will make more sense to you to have full sentences to be able to read through the handout rather than just having these kind of random bullet points. And so I'll invite you after the presentation because I'm talking about so many things right now, and your head will be so full, at lunch. And so to be able to go back after, after you've taken a step back and to read it through again and again, and to be able to deepen that for yourselves. But so to go back to the attachment, one of the things that I'll talk about later in the slides is how can we work on deepening that attachment? So I mentioned that the first level is physical proximity. The second level is through what we call sameness, having things in common. And so I would invite you to take the time to highlight with the kids that you have in your group to notice what are those things that you have in common with them, things that you like, things that physically appearance, mannerisms, clothing, same color of clothing. It could even be things that you both dislike. Doesn't really matter what it is, but as long as you guys can find things in common, this will help to deepen that attachment from physical proximity to now sameness. And so even if they get to be with the next person, they're able to hold on to you a little bit more. And so, in comparison with the 5-year-old, they still have a harder time with separation, but they have a somewhat of an easier tolerance to separation than the 4-year-old. And this will depend on, I don't want you guys to think on age. It's not 4 versus 5 for this one specifically. It's a question of development. So you could have a 5-year-old equally non-tolerant to separation to a 4-year-old, even though they're a year older, because the circumstances in that child's life has not led to them deepening their attachment. It's all a question of conditions to deepen that attachment. Somebody wrote in the chat, what key developmental differences should we consider between boys and girls in early childhood, especially regarding emotional regulation, social interaction, development, etc.? How can these inform tailored interventions and actions? It's a really great question. And I don't want to generalize, okay? Because there are situations where I've seen this equally to girls and boys, but it is true, to some extent that boys are more sensitive than girls, that the development for boys can be not as quick to some extent, given the sensitivity that boys have, and also the way in which our society is in place right now. That oftentimes, it's kind of like a message, an underlying message that, boys need to be tough, that there's no room for tears. Even if we explicitly say that it's okay and that we invite the tears, it's so ingrained in our society that there's sometimes a discomfort with boys and tears. And so this has an impact. It slows down the rhythm of their maturation. And so, yes, I think you're right, that there could be a small piece there, boys versus girls, but I don't want to generalize this because I've seen some, little girls that are very sensitive in that way too. And so I don't want it to put it all on boys. And I've seen the opposite happen as well, where some boys can be more mature than some girls. But it's true to some extent that that's a fact. All right. In terms of their attention, oh my goodness, at that age, they have such a short attention span, and they need to move. They're so highly energetic. And so, we need to be careful in the way that we set up our day, not having them sit down too long, doing a task that takes too much time. They're not going to be successful at this, and this is going to affect their sense of competence. And they may feel from us that we're disappointed that they cannot fulfill that expectation. And so, yes, for the 5-year-old, there might be a little bit of a better ability to some extent in terms of attention, but their attention is still so short and they still need that space to move. How can we implicate movement in our activities? Like if we're having children, with us as we're reading a book, as long as they're just not distracting the rest of the group, they don't all need to sit down in a circle and not move an inch. It would be okay for them to have different positions. And not all kids do well sitting down. Maybe some kids need to be standing up and they can be behind the group to not disturb the other kids. But how can we accommodate and be a bit more inclusive? As long as they're focused, that's what matters. And so to be able to be mindful and flexible with that child's ability to focus and what they need to be able to focus. In terms of play, absolutely play is so needed and central for both of 4 and 5-year-olds. The only difference I would say to some extent is at 5, many of them still do a lot of parallel play. They don't yet have fully that ability to be able to play together really and interact together on the same play. Whereas at 5, they may begin to be able to have more of that interaction within their play. And so keep that in mind, as it's to be expected that they will both play and maybe play on the exact same thing, but they'll be doing it next to each other, each in their own bubbles. In, and for the 5-year-old, they do have to some extent a better ability with fine motor, with gross motor. They do have to some extent a better development of their language compared to the 4-year-old. But again, I do not want to generalize this. It depends on the child. Okay, in terms of the immature child, they have a hard time with certain things because of the fact that some parts of their brain is not fully developed just yet. For example, the cerebellum, because it is underdeveloped, the cerebellum is a part of the brain, which helps with the way in which we find information, and that we're able to use that information in the way that we will apply, for going from thought to action. At that age, they have a hard time retrieving information. So even if, I'll give you an example to make it really concrete, even if you've done the exact same situation where we're getting kids to dress up in a certain order and we've practiced it, it is difficult for an immature child to be able to go and retrieve the sequencing of getting dressed, especially if they're upset. Even if you've practiced it many, many times, not all children to the same ability are able to get into their brains the information that was stored from times before where we've practiced things. And so we mustn't be surprised if we find ourselves repeating ourselves over and over again. It's because of the underdeveloped cerebellum. The other piece that plays
This
hand in
doesn't make
hand with
them
that,
weak. This
sorry,
doesn't make them weak.
right,
This
right.
doesn't make them weak.
Yeah, it's not a memory problem. It's just because the cerebellum is not yet fully developed, and so they're able to some extent from one time to the next access that information. But if they're upset, it's really difficult for them to access anything if they're upset or if they're stressed. That's another thing as well. So if we're rushing kids to get ready for transition. Rushing will make it even more difficult for them to be able to retrieve information.
I'm sorry to
The other,
interrupt. I
yeah,
just I
go
just
ahead.
had a really important comment
Yeah.
when you were talking about the attachment piece. If we even give thought to a lot of our schools right now, we're seeing a big influx of children, that are immigrating here,
Mm,
and we have a lot of kids from the Ukraine and a lot of kids from refugee families. So if
yeah.
we think
The
of their
trauma.
bag, the trauma that they have that they have experienced, that attachment piece is huge. So before we even get to anything else, we really
Yeah.
have to focus on them feeling safe.
What
So
100%, Connie. And not just that. It's so yes, a question of attachment in the now, but it's also for us to anticipate that if their energy went towards survival and not growth, that they will be behind in terms of their abilities. And the thing is that you can't skip steps. And so even if you're a 5 or 6-year-old, if you haven't developed those abilities, they're not just going to pop up one shot. They're going to do the exact same rhythm as when they were younger, but just delayed. Yeah. So the other piece that plays hand in hand is what we call the corpus callosum. The corpus callosum is basically the bridge in the middle of our brain that connects the two hemispheres. And so the right and the left hemisphere have different jobs. And in order for us to have a whole picture of the situation, because remember that the right hemisphere focuses on the big picture and the left hemisphere focuses on details. But in order to have a whole picture, you need to have a good communication between the both hemispheres of the brain. So a child who does not have a well-developed corpus callosum, not only are they not able to find information efficiently, but they're not able to have to see the whole perspective. They're so hyper-focused on themselves or on the one situation, and this will skew their ways in which they will get impacted and react to their environment. And I spoke about this at length just before, the fact that their prefrontal cortex is not developed or not developed at all or just a little. This will impact the way in which they'll manage their emotions, and their reactions will be without filter. So even if when we speak to them, thinking about those bright kids that have good expression, they're able to verbalize well, even when we have the conversation with them after the incident and they give us all the right answers, it's not because they know, that they're able to do better in that situation because the emotion overwhelms reason. And that's where oftentimes adults get caught up. They get caught up with the fact that the child, after the fact, when they have the conversation, will give them all the right answers. And they say, well, the child knows. They know they've done wrong. They know what they should be doing instead. And so why are they finding themselves in that situation time and time again? Are they choosing to do this? Is this intentional? Is this on purpose? I promise you it's not. Even if the child has all the right answers, it is different when they are in a calm place after the fact versus when they're in the middle of that incident. They are not able to access what they need in order to be mature in that moment. And so I'll let you guys read through this slide. I'm basically talking about the hypersensitive child, the child who is emotionally intense, how all of that has an added pressure in terms of the development of maturation. The same thing with their trauma. You were just talking about Connie trauma and our kids coming from, from Ukraine. We know now with neuroscience, this is the beauty about having, technology. We're able to see things that we couldn't see before. Before they were hypotheses. Now we're able to truly see the activation in the brain and to fully understand what's happening. And so you have here on the left-hand side a fully healthy brain, a child who's been brought up in a positive, healthy life without adversity, versus the child here on the right-hand side. This is actually the imagery of a brain of a child who was brought up in an orphanage with severe neglect. And so we see the lack of activation in the brain. It's not that there's actual holes in the matter. The matter's there. It could eventually, if the right conditions are there and time and space to grow, it's just that right now those parts of the brains are not activated. And so thinking about those kids that you guys, from Ukraine and whatnot, chances are there could be parts of that that has been impacted. And we also know the younger that they are, the more that this will have an impact in the development. So if let's say the trauma happened from birth to let's say, the 4 or 5 year old, it will have a bigger impact on the lack of development that it would have had if it happened later in life, because then they would have had from 0 to 5 that opportunity for that prefrontal cortex and those other elements to have some growth. Whereas if it happens right from birth, oh my goodness, there's no space and room for that growth. And I've been talking about, growth and maturation. I want to give you guys a concrete understanding of what I mean by maturation. What does that look like, a child who's mature? And so there's 3 processes that work together to bring forward what we call maturation for somebody to be mature. And so those 3 processes are emergence. Emergence is basically becoming your own person and moving yourself forward. Adaptation is to be able to adjust yourself to a situation or to learn from, a mistake. And integration, this requires executive functioning. This is from the prefrontal cortex. There's all of the fruits that come from that. So just really quickly, being emergent is basically being curious, having your own ideas, having some sense of responsibility, being independent, being aware of others' boundaries and respecting those boundaries. Adaptation is learning from your mistakes, accepting limits and restrictions, being resilient. So even if there's adversity that comes, you can bounce back from it, being resourceful. And integration is being considerate of others, being able to self-control, being patient, courageous, having perspective. All of these elements that I've named here, our 4 and 5 year olds are nowhere near to have any of these fruit right now. These
And
are
that's why
fruit.
play is so important, because it
Yes, yes.
absolutely helps with the maturation process. They can't work on self-control and being considerate and being courageous and taking perspective if they're just sitting at a table doing a worksheet, for example. That's why when we talk about the best environment for them to grow in and to learn and to develop is through play. That's
My
the
goodness,
most
Connie,
natural context for them.
can't say it enough. I have a whole section dedicated to play and the benefits of play. I mentioned before the difference between a child and a student. It's not about being a student that learns. The job of the child is to play. That is their job. And play is learning. Through play, learning will come. As somebody asked in the chat, to some extent, would you say that using the term immature and 4-year-old is redundant? Absolutely. 4-year-olds by default are immature. And so it's not a question of saying, is that 4-year-old mature, immature? They're not mature. None of them are. They're all immature by default. And the 5-year-old, they are beginning to get towards that maturation. They're not mature either. Being mature is actually gaining all of these fruit that I've just named to you. Until we have all these fruit, you're not considered to be mature. And so you're right. A young child by default is not mature. And I need to say, not only is play vital to the growth of these elements, but the fruit of maturation are not things that we can teach or that we can push. These are things, if we understand how development works, we have to have faith in the developmental plan. If we go back to the analogy of the tomato plant, we have faith that the yellow flower will turn into a red tomato. We need to have faith that the brain is designed to be able to get to that red tomato by itself. It's not about pulling the yellow flower into a red tomato. It's about creating the right conditions to let it unfold on its own naturally. And so your job, let's remove pressure from our shoulders. Why are we forcing ourselves as teachers to impose teaching and tugging and pulling at these different fruits of maturation? We are trying to do nature's job. Let's be a midwife to nature rather than try to take nature's place. Let's just be there with them and set those conditions.
And that is setting the conditions, right? When we have that play piece, that's why it's so crucial when we set up our schedules to really have those play periods in first and everything else works around it. I know many teachers always say, but I don't have time to get to my program. That is the program, correct?
Thank you.
And when we are limiting their playtime, they may be sitting down and doing that worksheet or that workbook that you have prepared for them. They may be doing it and doing it well, but the fact remains is that there will eventually be a gap because they are missing out on the key parts of the maturation process. So they may be doing it and may be eager to do it, but that doesn't take away the fact that their brain development, there will be gaps because that play really does allow them to mature and practice all those and learn and develop those executive function skills. So we can't say it enough. That is the biggest block in your day should be that play part.
For sure. And actually, the other piece too, you're just reminding me, I mentioned before that growth happens at rest also, not just in sense of safety, but also in rest. We know for a fact that physical growth happens at night, right? It's during the nighttime that we have the biggest growth spurts because that's when the hormone of growth comes out. But it's actually the same thing with the emotional growth. It's actually in moments of rest that our growth happens. There is nothing wrong with having pockets of time of just being with the kids, just exploring things, not overstimulating. We've forgotten, how nature is made. And even at home with parents, I'm even thinking about babies where we right from the first years, we overstimulate our kids. We get them in those playpens with all of these activities where we think that giving them music and sound and colors and shapes, that this will help them grow faster. We're messing with nature rather than just letting nature run its course and being a midwife to it. We are messing with nature. You guys need to remove that pressure from having to overstimulate our students. Children, there's no need to do that. Growth will happen in times of rest. And you know what? You talked about play, but the other piece that's huge as well is nature, going outside. Can we bring the kids outside, have some fresh air to be able to touch nature? There's something in our design that we are made to be in nature. And so how can we maximize that as well to the best of our abilities? And I know it's not easy to bring a group of little ones outside, having that appropriate supervision and all of that. But my goodness, does it make a difference? I see I've gone to visit schools that will have outdoor K4, K5 programs. And the difference I see in those kids that are less agitated, less overstimulated, that seem to be in a better place, less impulsive, get along better with their peers. It's not because they're nicer kids or more mature kids. We've just set up the conditions for them to be more successful. And so even if you cannot be outside all the time, can we find pockets of time where we can bring them outside? And if you don't have help, another adult, how can we get parents to be able to volunteer and to come and help out to have extra bodies? That could be a way to be able to manage that. So I'm going to walk this through fairly quickly because I've spoken about some of it, but I want to make sure we have enough time to walk through all the presentation. And I know we're taking a break in about 15 minutes. So I talked about the fact that our 4 or 5-year-olds are impulsive. We call this the untempered nature. They're not tempering their emotions. And so part of it is because they're living, as I mentioned, one emotion at a time. It is what we call the purity of that emotion. There's a purpose for that. If you were to experience all emotions at once, you could not fully grasp the experience of that one emotion. So the brain is made in such a way that they're making you experience one emotion at a time to get the full picture of that one emotion. And so there's no room for gray, it's black and white. And what's cute about that, and it goes hand in hand with this purity and of emotion, is because it's also purity of thought, is the belief in magic. The fact that children believe in magic is because, like even thinking about or younger, even younger kids that don't have that sense of the permanency of object, and that if you were to hide the object and re-show it, it looks like as if it's disappeared and come back. This comes from the same place. And so it's so cute at that age to have that view of magic, but this is where it comes from. It's having that one thought at a time, that one feeling at a time. They know better than they can behave, and they're also short-sighted in their situation because they're not able to see the full picture. I've talked about this, and so they have a hard time with problem solving, which means that if we have conflict between peers, we need to help them walk it through. There is no way that they're able to problem solve a conflict with a peer. Also, they're not able to problem solve any type of activity which would require more of that executive functioning skill. They're not there yet. Connie, you want to say something?
Yeah, I was thinking about when we talk about their emotions, if we think about, I mean, this happens daily for all teachers, and I'm sure they could relate, is if something's gone wrong, let's say even in one of your play centers, and, little Johnny has like hit another kid with a Lego over the head, well, at that moment, he's upset and that's all he could deal with, right? We can't get him to the point of saying, you need to be sorry now, right? So there's so many steps to that. So, and it
My
is
goodness,
hard
yeah.
because we don't want it to escalate as teachers. So
Yeah,
this knowledge and being able to understand their brain development is so crucial into how we react with them, because as human beings, we just want everybody to be safe and okay. And,
absolutely.
just say sorry and we'll be done with it, But the walking through it is so crucial to understand that. So thanks for addressing that.
Yeah, thanks, Connie. And you'll see at the end of the presentation, I have a step-by-step on managing conflict between children and how can we do it from a developmentally appropriate way. And so ultimately, it's about us kind of taking care of that situation with them and for them. They're not able to do that just yet. And so not only are we being their prefrontal cortex for them, but we're also modeling how to be able to, and eventually it will stick, but they're not at a place where they can right now. There's a question in the chat about forms of play. I'm going to get to play, and so I won't answer the question just yet. It depends on how the center is set up, but we'll talk about play a bit further in the presentation. And so, of course, if their emotions are untempered, then to your point, Connie, about the child who hit the other child on the head with the Lego, they cannot help themselves in that moment. Something triggers them, they get upset, they react. And the reason for that is because the brain is made in such a way to be able to feel each emotion separately. And so anger needs to be frustration, sorry, needs to be felt first. And so he's not able to feel frustration and feel sorry or feel remorse. There's none of the two at the same time. He's all in that frustration in that one moment. And I
All
kind
the
of touched
teachers can
upon this.
exhale now. All the teachers
Sorry?
can exhale. We can all exhale now because and that's the part I think that does become, for the whole all the 109 participants that are here, that's the part that does become overwhelming as a preschool teacher because there's a lot of little brains that you're working with simultaneously, and they're all experiencing these
Yeah.
emotions at the same time.
Yeah.
And so the classroom management does become challenging and it does become
To say the
overwhelming and
least.
exhausting, right?
Really.
So I really feel, I know I was in it. It is an overwhelming place to be.
Yeah, we were not meant to be in the circumstances that we've set ourselves out to be in the sense that we're the only species in the world that will give our children to others to take care of. No other species on the planet will do this than us. And developmentally, we're not made to actually be taken care of unless they're within the same village. We're not meant to be taken care of by strangers. And so how can school become an extension of home and to be able to set that up? And not only are we not, it was not meant in the design for children to be raised by others, we were never meant developmentally to have children of all the same age in the same space. If we were to have honored attachment and development, we would have had multi-age classrooms, kind of like homes, like families, where we have families of multiple ages, where the it's not just the adult who's in charge, but the adult can take care of the older child, who takes care of the middle child, who takes care of the younger child. There's a hierarchy happening where we've got support. Our parents and grandparents who grew up in bigger families never did this by themselves. They had, older children helping out, neighbors and, extended family and so forth. We've never been more isolated in our society where both parents are working. We've got single home families. We've got, now that we've put in our 4-year-olds in the school, we've really gone against the nature of things, unfortunately. And now we're stuck having to pick up the pieces and to try to make it work with the situation. Not that it's impossible to make it work. I think it is possible, but we just need to think it through and to do it right, considering development and attachment.
Thank you.
Yeah. I mentioned this briefly before about they're inconsiderate, they're egocentric, and so things like being diplomatic is so not typical of that age. They don't know how to filter themselves. So if a child smells another child who smells bad, it's to be expected that they may say something like, "Oh, she smells," and to pinch their nose. And parents get so embarrassed by these things, right? And think, oh my God, my child is so impolite or so disrespectful. It's not a question of disrespect. They're not doing this intentionally to hurt the other person's feelings. They are in that moment so within their own experience, they're not able to think about the other person's feelings. It's not meant to be mean. It's just what it is. And so it's one-sided, it's single-minded. So I talked about being unfair. Unfairness means, you know, that they haven't gotten it all. That's how they see it. And so the thing about that is the reason why they're like this is because they cannot do togetherness without losing either themselves or the other person in that situation. Togetherness for them becomes fusional. I don't know if you notice when little ones get together and they start playing, how much they fuse to each other. They will copy each other, they will mimic, they will even take on the same accent in the way that they speak with the other child that they're fused with. They'll like the same things. They forget themselves. There's a reason for that. Part of it is because of the attachment. Remember that the second way in which we attach is through sameness. And so there's a need and attachment to be similar in order to connect and to feel safe. And so on the one hand, we have the attachment instinct that works against it. And on the other hand, if we go back to the slides on the fruit of attachment, this one here, where I talk about, that sense of independence and awareness of others' boundaries and making our own boundaries, this comes with maturation, which means that our younger children that don't have yet that ability to be able to separate themselves from others, get sucked in and fuse to others. They forget themselves. So when they're thinking of others, they cannot hold on to themselves. And when they think of themselves, they cannot consider another. It's one or the other. And so part of it is because the development has been made for them to be able to build their what we call individuation, their sense of self, become their own person. You cannot do this if you're fused to other people. And so you need to be able to have that protective bubble to be able to figure out who you are. And so there's resistance that comes with that. Oftentimes we have, from the age two where we call it the terrible twos, where they say no to everything. To the I'm not going to call the terrible twos to the something threes and fours. That resistance is part of the development, because they need to become their own person. So we need to not get surprised when they become resistant and oppositional. They're trying to find their voice. They're trying to find their person in that. And so there's ways around it. I actually have a whole presentation that I do on opposition and resistance, understanding the nature of it and how do we work with it and around it. For those who will be doing the book study, Rest, Play, Grow, Deborah McManara has a whole chapter dedicated to the child who does it themselves and that opposition and resistance. I invite you to go and take a look at that. Even on her website, on a blog, she has a whole editorial on this as well. And so, because they have not yet fully developed everything, we need to understand that it's not about teaching social skills. It's very difficult for them to not have those skills because they're not yet developed. So rather than trying to push on social skills, making them get along, we need to put in place the right structures to safe keep them from each other, and eventually that will come. I feel like I've said this already, so I'm going to move forward. Let's see. Yeah. So why does it take time for the brain to develop? Why does it develop so slowly? And this kind of fits into my same point before about the importance of rest, for us to not always be constantly stimulated. It's because the brain needs time and rest in order to be oriented to the world that they're in, to be able to, whatever they've gained, to be able to integrate that and to grow from that. This not only takes time, but it needs space and it needs rest. And so it will happen, as I mentioned this before, they won't always listen to us because in that moment, if they're not attending to us, they're attending to something else, then they're not able to fulfill that request that we have. So just a little tidbit on this piece, because sometimes as adults, we have like our strategies and where we want to, catch attention of students and the children in the classroom. We need to be really careful, especially at that young age, that it's not about just saying out loud to the rest of the group, okay, children, now it's time, dot, dot, dot. It's about making sure that we've received individual engagement and orientation from each of the children. Some children need to make sure that the eye contact has been done and we've engaged them first before we move on to the task at hand. Some children don't do very well at all with eye contact. It actually overstimulates them. And so how can we, other than eye contact, make sure that they're attuned to us? Sometimes coming closer in physical proximity, being in their space, coming down to their level, all of that can help to be able to engage them before we move on to the task. All right. I'm going to go ahead and skip a little bit some of these slides. And oh, we've got somebody who I guess came in late or got skipped out. So all this to say, I was talking about safety and rest, but safety and rest also, attachment is part of that and also fits into it. And so I want to take a moment to talk about the importance of attachment and how do we go about putting in place these attachment practices to maximize the environment and conditions to help them to grow. Sometimes I will talk about attachment in certain presentations, and people will say to me, Catherine, I understand attachment. I love my students, and we're there together all year round, and I do what I need to do, and so my kids are attached to me. Attachment's a little more complicated than for us to like our students. And it's actually a two-way street as well. And so some kids, just by being present and showing a smile, being able to engage with them, that's enough to gain their attachment. But there are other children for whom it's not that simple. They've gotten, and even they've had negative experiences in their young childhood about ambivalent or negative models of attachment. And so those kids come into our classroom with trust issues for a good reason. And so it's more difficult to be able to build that rapport with those kids. And so how can we go about keeping that in mind, working on attachment with all of the range of children that we have in our group? So I think one piece, oops, I skipped a slide here. The one piece is in terms of the greeting and engaging children. It's not just about greeting them first thing in the morning. Every single time that we transition from one task to a next, if they go elsewhere with another adult and come back to you, it's not because you're their teacher that by default they will re-engage into you. It's not by role, it's who you are to the child and whether in that moment you are engaged and oriented towards each other. And so every single time we go from one transition to the next, we need to re-engage their attachment. And it doesn't take long to do that. I mean, sometimes, it could be by singing a song, or it could be by telling a story, smiles. Sometimes, our facial expressions can speak volumes into getting kids reoriented towards us. But we need
I
to
was
make
gonna I
sure
was
that
gonna
they're all
suggest
attuned.
that sorry to interrupt you. I'm really
No,
sorry.
go
I'm
ahead.
happy you brought up the singing
Yeah.
and the storytelling. That's why it's so important for us as teachers to be the ones singing with them and reading the stories to them, because when they're looking at us, they're trying, they're looking at our facial expressions, they're looking at our
Yes.
physical gestures, right? So in obviously sometimes we want to put the song on the smartboard, and that's totally fine. Nobody's telling you not to do that at all. But the importance of us being the majority of the time. The smartboard on with
Yes.
the videos, that's fine sometimes, but the majority of the time it really should be the teacher reading the story, the teacher singing the song with the physical movements, because that's a piece of attachment that's being built as well. So that's a crucial moment in the day.
It's so I'm glad you brought this up, Connie, because this is a piece 20 years ago that we didn't need to think about. The presence of screens and digital devices. And the truth of the matter is that digital devices and screens are a competition to our attachment building. And so every single time that the child has their eyes oriented towards a screen rather than us, we have lost an opportunity to build that rapport with them. And so I would say, even at the beginning of the school year, when you have not yet developed that relationship with all of the kids, that we would have not at all or little of devices. And that it's only when we have developed more of that attachment and that they're all oriented towards us, that now we could have pockets of time to give us respite as well. I could understand that, relying on the screen is giving us, it's like a backup for us, right? It's giving us that respite while the children are listening to something, we could attend to something else. But if we do only of that, then we are losing opportunities to be able to build that rapport with kids. The screen becomes our direct competition. And
So
so we
now
really need
what
to
you
be careful.
said is so crucial before we go. It's so crucial to even understand where our little guys are coming from. So think of all the little children in your classroom that are being raised now in a time when
My goodness.
screens and digital devices are really all over the homes. And a lot
Yeah.
of them, not only are parents struggling with the children on devices, but children are in competition for their parents' attention
Oh,
with these
yes.
devices, right?
Oh,
And
yes.
there have been so many studies done on the neglect factor. It may not be
Yes.
intentional neglect as we know it historically,
Yeah.
but the fact that children are competing for their parents' attention with these devices. So just imagine the attachment issues that they're coming to school with already
Hmm. Hmm.
because of these devices. And a lot of our preschoolers that we're seeing now, I know we always go back to it, but it has to be said, a lot of these preschoolers were born during pandemic,
Pandemic.
during that time, during the pandemic, when the parents were home, they had to work, they had to take care of these babies. There's a whole attachment piece that we really do have to take into consideration. And I do believe that's a crucial point. So I'm glad you brought that up because it
Yeah, there's studies that are also showing, mothers on their screens while they're breastfeeding, and all of the impact of that, and the I don't know if you guys know this, but when at birth, the child's capacity for sight is the distance of their sight is just long enough to be able to see mom's eyes when the mom is breastfeeding the baby. And so it is done. It's interesting how nature is made, right? It's purposefully done this way so the child can connect with mom through breastfeeding. So now if the screen gets in between the child who's breastfeeding and the mother who's on the screen, we have these kids that are coming into our classrooms with deficits, with true deep deficits. And so, it is making our job more difficult because they haven't had the first 4 years of being able to build properly that attachment. So they're coming to us more immature in their attachment development as well, not just in terms of their brain development, but their maturation and their attachment abilities. Typically, I said there were 6 different ways in which we attach. If all is well put in place, every single year of a child's life is an added on way of attaching. So from birth to age 6 is every single new way of attaching that adds on. But if the child has not worked through, and by the way, they're sequential. So if you haven't worked through the first one, you do not skip to the next one, which means that babies that have not had the physical proximity well fulfilled because of the screens beginning in the way come to us at school with no more than the ability to attach through physical proximity, and they're insecure in it because it hasn't been well fulfilled. So no wonder we're having kids that have mental health issues, that separation is difficult, that they're stressed and so forth. Not only are they getting overstimulation from the screens, but they're getting less play, more screen. So less play as well has shown an increase in mental health issues, and they're not getting the good enough attachment. So we do not have nowadays the same child coming to school than we did 20 years ago. It's not the same kid, not at all
so
in any
for the
way, shape, or
teachers
form.
that so the teachers here that have been teaching you know since the late 90s, probably like me, yes, that when we say the kids are not the same anymore, no, they're not the same anymore because where they're coming from is not the same anymore.
Yeah,
Their experiences are very different than that of 20 years ago, 25 years ago. I think we're going
exactly.
to take a break though right now. It's 10:17.
I was going to finish this
Oh,
the
yes, go
attachment
ahead.
slides, and then we'll
Please
take the
do.
break. All right.
Great.
So, I mean, you're gonna tell me as you're looking at these slides. I mean, these are common sense. Yes, they're common sense, but there's things that we take for granted that think that are being done on its own because of what we just talked about. The fact that kids do not have that good enough attachment. We need to be that much more explicit and intentional in what we do in terms of our nonverbal and verbal, showing delight. How often, because we get so stressed with our own work, and we forget that even if we're being nice to the kids, what is our nonverbal saying to the kids? They're watching us more than they're listening to us. Making sure that the connection is genuine. It's not just about the classroom, getting to know them beyond, what it is that happens in the classroom, knowing their names. My goodness, my daughter, who's in high school now, said to me last year, one of her teachers that she wasn't really fond of, and part of the reason why was because the teacher wasn't taking the time to get to know the kids' names. To me, this is basic, but it's things we take for granted and forget. So important, even though it's basic, it's the most important. In terms of, and this will be the last slide before the break, not just getting interested in what they're interested in and working on the sameness with them, but showing them that we remembered about what they're talking about in the conversation, sitting down with them, during snack time. You talk about, reading the story, dancing with them. Sometimes we let them do it and we're just there as an observer. Being with them and doing it with them changes everything. If there are going to be other adults in the room, make sure those other adults are introduced. Or if you have a hard time connecting with that child, find out who their attachments are and use them as a matchmaker to build that rapport with them, whomever that adult might be. If the child misbehaves or that there's an incident of some sort, we need to be explicit with them about the fact that their behavior is not the bottom line and that our relationship will trump that. Sometimes we think they know, we need to say it. We need to tell them, today was a difficult day. Tomorrow's going to be another day. I look forward to, us trying this or doing that. They need to hear it from us. And of course, the engagement of the family. How could we get the family involved to be able to be the extension of the family and work all together? Because how often I will see that the parents don't trust school and will tell their kids they don't trust the school. And now the child feels caught up in between these two worlds and they're having a hard time to attach to school because they want to be loyal to their parents. So if we could get the parents in and let them know about this importance of being together for the sake of the child, the difference that this will make. All right, let's take a short break. I think, Connie, you can just pause the recording.
It says stop though.
So, okay, so just stop it and yeah, just stop it and we'll start it again then. And I'll